Welcome to At the Table. At the Table is a series of roundtable discussions where Asian American Christian leaders and pastors are able to draw from their experiences, their education, and their expertise to discuss questions and issues that are pertinent and relevant to Asian American Christians and the broader church at large. At the Table is a production of AACC, or the Asian American Christian Collaborative, and I am so thrilled to be at the table with my three distinguished guests. We'll be talking about how to effectively reach and disciple the next generation, especially how we can flourish in discipling the next generation. I'm going to have each of you go around and just briefly share about yourself. Maybe we'll start with you, Alan.
Sure. My name is Dr. Alan Ye. I am a professor of Intercultural Studies and Missiology at Biola University in Southern California.
Hi, my name is Susan Lim, and I'm a former professor at Biola University. I've retired, and now I'm writing full-time.
And I'm Vivian Mabuni. I am a speaker, a podcast host, an author, and a fan of AACC.
Well, so thrilled to be together. Very excited to have this conversation. In 60 seconds or less, what does flourishing mean to you?
Yeah, so when I think about flourishing, I think of two things. One is being unhindered, and then the second is living out your purpose or your calling. So the second one is more Aristotelian, kind of like, what is your telos? What is your end goal? So, Aristotle said, if there's a knife, what is a good knife? It is one that cuts well, right? What is its ultimate purpose? And, sort of Westminster Confession-ish, you can say that the end goal of humans is to, worship God and enjoy Him forever. But also on a more human level, what are we created for in terms of making an impact in this world? But I think, especially with the younger generation, there's things that are hindering them. So it's kind of like you're asking them to run, but they have shackles on their legs and they can't even walk. So in order to get them to run, we need to take the shackles off their legs. And I feel like the shackles come in three forms. One is hindrances from the world, another is hindrances from themselves, and another is hindrances from older generations. Mm-hmm. And so I'd love to unpack those three, but yeah. So I think if we can unshackle and allow them to flourish, to run, that's what flourishing is.
I would say for me, flourishing is thriving in our relationship with God and thriving in our relationship with others. And for the younger generation, at least for a lot of the people in my children's lives and for my children as well, their faith has largely been a borrowed faith and their parents' faith. But when that faith becomes their own, I would say that's flourishing. And then the relationships that they have with their friends, with their not only peers, but people that might be a little bit older, siblings, and maybe even bullies, how to navigate those relationships. And when they do that well, I feel like that's flourishing. So loving God well and loving your neighbor.
That's great. I would just add to that the Hebrew word shalom that we often think of as just like a greeting. It means integrity and wholeness. And so there would be shalom with God, kind of what you're talking about, Susan, with one another and with the land. And I think about when there's that kind of flourishing going on, the natural byproduct will be just richer relationships, a sense of connection with God so that He can direct their steps. So that connectiveness, even with the land, I think this generation up and coming, they're very aware of even just the planet, I think, more than our generation. So that's what I think of when I think of flourishing.
So it's a comprehensive definition. This is good. I wonder then, especially as I'd be curious if you can also identify your ethnic backgrounds, and then if you have children, or what your relationship with the next generation is.
Sure. My mom is originally from mainland China. My dad is from Taiwan, so Chinese/Taiwanese American. My wife is Caucasian, and so we have a Hapa kid. And so, raising him in a bicultural manner, and also, I think trying to encourage his Asian heritage that is within him, but also protecting him from some of the toxicity of older gen Asian influences. It's kind of a both and, right? Like you want some of that in there, but you kind of don't want some of that in there. So I think it's an interesting and tricky thing to navigate.
I'm Korean American, and my husband is also Korean American, so my kids are Korean American. I have two, and one is 15. She just started high school, and my son is 14, and he's in 8th grade. And I would say, for the most part, my relationship with them has been wonderful. I feel really lucky to be their mom. They're pretty great kids. Yeah.
That's great. I'm Chinese American. My parents were both born in China, and then they fled when the Japanese invaded to Taiwan. So there was a period of time. And then I was born in Wisconsin when they were working. So they came to the United States through the education route. My husband is Okinawan, Native Hawaiian, and Portuguese. So none of my 3 kids look the same. Like you see them all and they don't look like they belong to each other, but they do. And so my oldest son is 30. Then I have a son and his newish wife. They're 26, and then my daughter's 21, almost 22. So my husband and I have worked with Cru, and we were in the campus ministry for 28 years. So I love always thinking about this next generation and raising up the next generation of leaders. So that is a passion that still has not gone away.
Yeah, so all of us have worked with college students. You're still working with college students. You have college students. You have high school students. My baby is almost a year old. And so as you think about not just your kids, but all kids, yeah, especially as we're, in the work that I'm doing, especially with 10 by 10, one of the things that we're finding, and a lot of the major catalyst for the work was that 1 million young people are walking away from the faith every year. So by the year 2050, it's expected that somewhere around like 35 to 40 million young people will have disaffiliated from the Christian faith. If you ask, there's one research study that was done, why young people are leaving. They said it's hypocrisy, the church is unloving, and the church is irrelevant. And so the teaching is not relevant to them. They feel like the church is manipulative, and they don't know how to navigate differences or love people who are different than them. And then you have a whole host of other reasons why people really struggle with Christianity from the younger generations. I mean, even in another, at the table conversation we had with your daughter was one of our panelists. They were talking, and it was both very encouraging, but you can hear how much struggle they went through in order to kind of come to the place that they were. And I feel like they are in a better place when it comes to faith than many others that are part of their kind of generational cohort. And so I'm curious, 2 things. One is what does it look like when you're not flourishing? And then 2, in what ways can the next generation flourish in their faith, especially as they navigate these difficult times that we're in?
So when your first question is how...
What does the opposite of flourishing look like?
For them or for us?
For anybody.
For anybody.
Yeah. Like how, if you were to create a diagnostic and say, this, we kind of articulated what it looks like to flourish, but sometimes it's helpful to show the contrast. What does it look like when you're not flourishing? And then how can we start flourishing?
I think when someone is not flourishing, it's because they are focused on debilitating things. For example, if, let's just take your health, right? So if you have COVID, you're not able to do your job or to do your studies or to love other people well because you're just down and out. Well, I feel like for anybody, but especially for the younger generation, there's a lot of these things which just kind of bog them down, and all their energy and concentration goes into that just to keep their head above water, and that they're not able to spread their wings and do the things that they were meant to do. So I think part of it is the path to healing. But I also think that we can't wait until we are completely healed in order to move forward. Because, I mean, at what point will you be completely healed? Maybe never on this side of heaven. So I do think that we need to sort of operate with a wounded healer mentality, right? So as we are still recovering ourselves, we need to also help to move the needle forward with other people and in our work and in our ministry. So, and that's a tricky thing, right? Because you're asking people to progress when they can barely get out of bed. But it has to be both and at the same time. And I think we need to encourage each other in that.
You know, when I think of someone not flourishing, I think of like the Pharisees, for example. And they think they're flourishing, but they're not. They're dead in the law. And I think for us, when we do things that we do for a front, because I think we're all hardwired for self-promotion and self-glory and just self, because that's part of the fall. And then we do that with another layer of religion. I think that's not flourishing. And another thing for that, I think, would be when what you're talking about, that's such a horrible statistic for all these people to leave the church, but in a way that's honest, right? Because they're saying, we don't want to go through this front anymore. But the opposite of that is Jesus, who obviously is the way, the truth, and the life of flourishing. And he didn't say, don't go to synagogue or church, or he didn't say, don't pray or fast. He said, do it in the right way. So the answer isn't not doing it. The answer is Jesus, as we all know, but how did he do it? So I would say when I think of someone who is not flourishing, it's someone who believes that they have life, but they're not abiding. And so the opposite would be to abide. Yeah.
That's good. And when I think about not flourishing, the picture that I have in my mind is isolation. And I think that that is, as connected as people are on their phones, that's still not true connection. So isolation, I think, causes us to try to numb out through all sorts of unpopular, unhealthy ways, which range from substance abuse to even ministry. I think we can numb out on eating and shopping and social media, and we are trying to fill these cisterns that are broken. And so I think there's a sense that that isolation does not lend to a genuine ability to see what's true. And I think seeing what's true, it's easy, I think, for this up-and-coming generation to determine the truth based on what they're seeing on their phones. So you get this 1-minute soundbite of information that's not been processed. And there's so much information, and it's not being connected with real people in real life. So I think that technology is amazing. I think it's incredible. I think that there can be some robust conversations that happen online through Zoom chats and things like that, but it's not the same as walking with more people in real life through the ups and the downs. And so when I think about what flourishing would look like, even as people walk away from the faith, if they are not seeing integrity and honesty in the relationships of people in their churches and in their circles, they will find it in other places. And I think that's where this shift in, it's almost like the way that young people join gangs is they want a place to belong. And what was meant to be the church has become so distasteful because of the hypocrisy. So there's kind of a both and going on, like getting us being responsible and saying, yes, this is true, and not trying to hide any more of it, not being a part of additional church hurt, and then also being able to encourage them to still remain in relationship, because none of us are all going to agree on the same things, theologically, politically, or otherwise, but we are meant to still be together and not in isolation.
Well, we all agree on everything, right?
My husband and I don't even agree on everything.
Well, so in terms of next generation, because these are all good words and very insightful, especially as Asian Americans. I mean, a lot of times, one of the things I hear most often is how, basically Asian Americans or other minorities have to translate things that were made for basically a white community to their own context. And that cultural translation becomes very taxing because you have a lot of people aren't necessarily kind of trained to filter through like what would actually work within their context and what wouldn't work within their context. And what gets passed down then could be an assimilating version of a practice that doesn't actually lead to healing, but is almost a form of medication or a Band-Aid approach to like discipleship, healing, spiritual formation, whatever. When it comes to flourishing the next generation, for the next generation, especially as Asian Americans, what ways can Asian American younger people actually flourish? What do they need to do or what do we need to do as a church to help them to flourish? So what do they need to do and what do we need to do to help them flourish?
When I think about parenting styles, and I had mentioned earlier that this is one of the shackles, I think, that is on the feet of young people. There are two opposite extremes, and I think one extreme is the sort of old school Confucian authoritarian kind of thing, like because I said so, you just have to do it, and sort of a tiger mom or tiger dad mentality, right? And that can be traumatizing. And that especially a lot causes people to run away from the church or run away from their family or run away, and so this exodus of, the young people is in some ways no surprise if you see this kind of parenting. The opposite, I think, is the helicopter parent or the snowplow parent, okay? Sometimes called the lawnmower parent, right? Helicopter parents hover over their kids, watch everything they do, monitor everything. The snowplow or lawnmower parent sort of paves the way in front of the young person so that they don't have to overcome any obstacles, right? The parent sees the obstacle coming, the parent smooths it over, and then the young person doesn't have to hurdle it. Well, this is actually not very good because it leads to developmental delays, okay? Because they don't know how to overcome things, and then when they do overcome obstacles, they don't know how to handle it. I think of the phrase, you give a person a fish and you feed him for a day, but you give him you teach him how to fish and you feed him for a lifetime, right? And we need to teach young people how to fish. This is called grit. University of Pennsylvania, Angela Duckworth, professor, wrote a book called Grit, right? And it's, do you know how to overcome obstacles, and do you know how to pick yourself up after you fail? And this is the number one indicator of success in life. Not intelligence, not skill, it is grit, okay? So how do we instill grit in young people? And I get why parents do this. I mean, what I'm about to say might shock people, but when I was a kid, for elementary school, I would walk a mile to school by myself, each way, unsupervised, right? And parents these days would be like, oh my goodness, I would never let my kid do that. They'd be kidnapped. I mean, who knows what would happen, and safety issues, and I get that. But what it did is it taught me independence, and it taught me perseverance, and it taught me how to do things on my own. I got my driver's license on my 16th birthday. I could not wait. Kids these days, they don't get their driver's license until at least 21, if not older. Parents are still driving them everywhere when they're 21, right? And again, safety issues, I get it, right? But like I'd be 16, I'd go to the mall, hang out with my friends, and I didn't even have a cell phone, and my parents didn't know where I was. I mean, I know, shocking, right? But at the same time, I also developed independence. So it's this double-edged sword. How do we get our kids to be able to be independent, but also to be safe. And I think we need to balance those two sides. I do have to say that, so that's the parenting side where parents need to get it together. But then on the kids' side, they need to get off their screens. I mean, totally, you know, Jean Twenge, University of San Diego professor, wrote a book called iGen, and she says this generation's shaped by screens. They're being discipled by screens. You were referring to the doom scrolling, where every second they're seeing every disaster on Earth in real time. It's too much for them to handle. They can't digest all this. Put away the screens, get out into nature, be social with people, face to face, real people, right? And that's what they need. And it's a responsibility from both sides.
I have two words that come to mind. One is tradition, and I'm pretty sure it's not a monopoly of Asian Americans, but I do know a lot of Asian Americans that have, in Korean anyways, we call it 새벽 기도, which is like early morning prayer, and I love it. And Korean churches have, like at the New Year, we're gonna do like 2 weeks of 새벽 기도. So the whole church congregates like 5 a.m. So you have to wake up at 4 to get to church by 5. And I love those traditions. And there's something beautiful about having that kind of corporate tradition too. And then also, I came to faith when I was 17. I was the first in my family to receive Christ. I came from a Buddhist background. And by God's grace, my whole family got saved. Wow. And then my dad, after he became a Christian, was just all in. And he learned from his church that there was something called 가족 예배, which is family worship. And it was kind of funny at first because like we would all go around and share a little bit about the insights, and then he came up with something called 재고백, which is like confession of sins. And so we would be like, okay, and then someone would say something that they did and we'd be like, oh, that's so bad. How could you do that? And then my mom would often say, I didn't sin this week. And we're like, seriously, you did sin.
You just sin now.
Yeah, you just sin, right. It was a little bit funny getting it into kind of like a real rhythm, but you know, I inherited that from my parents. And so now we have 가족 예배. I love tradition. And my husband, he actually immigrated when he was 14. And I kind of love that about him. And the kind of respect and honor that he has for the older generation, I think is so beautiful. And I think a second part, the other word that comes to mind is authority. And one of the things that I feared the most as being a parent is that my kids would see me as the final authority. And so when I would mess up, I would say, gosh, that was wrong. Like God is not pleased with that. Because I wanted them to know that, because, you know, like we all have that father figure thing, right? We kind of see God the Father through our earthly dad or a parent. And I wanted them to know that that's not God. Like if I speak in anger or if I did something out of turn, like that's not God's heart. God doesn't see you like that. And so I think a part of them flourishing is to see those traditions and inheriting that, and then also spending time with their Heavenly Father. And for them to know Him through His Word. And the more you hear God's voice through His Word, you just know His heart for you. And I think it was Mark Batterson who said that a prophetic voice comes from a prophetic ear. And so you hear first before you can speak. And it's true, like we all want to speak and make a difference in the world, but you have to learn how to hear first. And so spend time in the Word, spend time in prayer. And if things seem wrong, don't leave the church, don't leave Jesus. Go to the Lord and say, is that okay? Right? And He will speak. You know, when I was little, there was something horrible that happened, and it was an abusive situation. And I had a really hard time getting over it. But one day I was reading where it says, it's better for you to tie a millstone around your neck and jump into the ocean than cause one of these little ones to stumble. And that word healed and set me free. And I believe in counseling. I've been in counseling and spiritual direction for most of my life. but it was that word that set me free. And so I would just say for the younger generation, go do your business with God, because he's real and he'll be there for you.
That's really powerful. Thanks for sharing that. That's, yeah, it's amazing when God intervenes in those ways. And so, and I mean, to what you're saying about tradition, you know, I think that's one of the things I'm mostly concerned about, is that there's almost this like full rejection, throwing the baby out with the bathwater of everything of old. And I think about my father-in-law, who's been pastoring for almost 30 years at the same Korean church. He preaches probably 1,000 times a year. Every morning at 5 a.m. he wakes up, and we're staying with him right now. And every morning he wakes up 5 a.m., goes to church for 새벽 기도, and they're there for 30 minutes. Then he comes home and sleeps to catch up on his sleep. And he preaches every single morning, you know. And it's just this faithful showing up, and it does something to you. And one of the things I think has been very encouraging is that there are a small number of Korean American pastors that are out throughout the country trying to figure out, what does it mean to be an Asian American pastor, an Asian American leader. And for them, one of the first things that they'll try to recover is the early morning prayer. And so they'll say, okay, we're going to pray at 7 a.m. because for that. And so they're like, okay, we're going to do this for a few weeks, and so on and so forth. And then I'm like, okay, when you guys become real Christians, real Korean Christians, you'll do it 5 a.m. But thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, I just think we can't be what we can't see. And so that's where representation it matters. And so I long for all of our children to grow up with role models of people that we would love for them to be like. And I think for so long, there haven't been a lot of role models. And so that's where it matters that we kind of move out. I think once we can break through a little bit of a threshold, like it's possible to have, to see someone who looks like me writing books, speaking, doing, being professors and being in places of leadership, all of a sudden it kind of opens up a whole new realm of like, I could do that. And there's something significant about our kids seeing role models that aren't just the ones that they see on a screen, or people who aren't people that have the moral and I'll cut. I just think it's important for our kids to be able to see people that are leaders of integrity, who are willing to admit when they're wrong, know how to confess and right things. Like, I don't think that the youth are looking for perfect people, but I think they're looking for real people that know how to make things right when they make mistakes. And so even as a parent, to apologize to our kids, that is saying something. It's like, I think that there's a writing that happens when a child experiences like, this was wrong, and now this person has made it right, and that helps them to go through life with grit. Like, it's okay to make mistakes. I think sometimes in our Asian culture, we are so prone to wanting to be people of excellence that we don't do well when we fail. And so teaching the youth to learn how to make mistakes, correct, self-correct, and be leaders that are going to be transparent enough to say, I blew it. This was, if I could have done this differently, this is how I would have done it differently, and these are some of the consequences, and I recognize that. This is how I want to try to make it right. That will go a long way, I think, with this hypocrisy piece that I think our youth are seeing. So a right apology, not an apology that says, if you felt offended, I'm sorry. No, it's like, what I did, I blew it, and this is how I blew it, and I own it. And that, I think kids are resilient, but they can also smell it from 100 miles away when it's fake, and they don't want fake. And I'm with them. There's so many things that the deconstruction movement right now, I can see the reasoning behind so many of the things that they're saying, that they're pointing out. I'm like, yes, I agree. This was just, so being able to acknowledge that, I think, is important. And I think the biggest thing in all of it with the flourishing of this next generation is to stay connected. And I think as parents and as the older generation is to not disown because of a search. You know, I think a lot of times what I've heard is that parents, if their kids go off on a different direction, they literally cut off any kind of connection. And it's like, we do not see the end of the story. And so our part is to stay connected. And I think that that's a word for us. As
Vivian, if I could dovetail on that, I love that. Yeah. Older generations need to apologize, need to be more transparent, need to acknowledge. I think we need to acknowledge to the younger people that, yes, your world is hard. In fact, it's harder than where we grew up with.
Yeah.
Right? This is going to be the first generation where they make less money than their parents. Okay?
Wow.
So it's like, we need to acknowledge that. They have to grapple with climate change and scarcity of resources and ultra competitiveness and everything. I mean, just everything's hard for them, right? And so, and just to say, I see you, we're sorry, and it sucks sometimes, right? But that's authenticity. Last thing, James Chang wrote a book called True Story, and he says that for each of the 4 generations, there's a gateway question that they resonate with. For boomers, it's what is true. For Gen X, it's what is real. For millennials, it's what is good. And for Gen Z, it's what is beautiful. Now, if you are not scratching their itch, they won't resonate with you. So if boomers go to Gen Z and they're like, well, let me just give you apologetics.
Yeah.
They're like, my question is not what is true. My question is what is beautiful. If you come to them with all your brokenness and say, I'm sorry, they see that as beautiful. And they will resonate with that.
Yeah.
But if you tell them, no, let me just tell you the truth and I'm gonna just offer, academic citations and my way is the highway, we're gonna lose them. I feel like that's one of the reasons why young people are running away from the church. I think we need to ask a different gateway question.
That's great.
That's great. I mean, especially because in Jesus you have all 4 of those things are answered, right? What's true, what's real, what's good, and what's beautiful. It's all in Christ. And I think you're absolutely right that younger generations have a more acute radar for BS. They can sniff out inauthenticity, and they have a great smell for what is phony. And so that to be able to be authentic is a real, not just gift but necessity in this day and age. Now we got to round out the conversation. But there's a 2-part question I want to ask is when it comes to I believe that if we're discipling people well and people are being discipled well, they will flourish, right? True discipleship should lead to flourishing because in Christ we are offered abundant life. The question I have for you, especially as we look at the Pew research that recently came out saying that 8% of Asian Americans, there's a decline in the church, and there's a lot of kind of like conversation around that, and we're working on a study through AACC to figure out a little bit more parsed out version of like the state of the Asian American church. But across the board, whether you're Asian American or not, it seems like we are in a discipleship crisis throughout the country. We've relied on programming over investing in people. There's a lot of show and trying to be relevant over developing relationships. People are more induced by entertainment than they are like a true preaching of the gospel. What does the church need to do and get our act right in when it comes to, especially the Asian American church, when it comes to discipling the next generation, so we don't see the current trends continuing on.
Please.
I think this division between the first and second gen, especially in the church worship service model, has been debilitating. You know, very typically you'll see that first gen will be the native language speaking Korean or Chinese speaking congregation. And then you have the EM, right? Second gen or third gen English ministry. But what happens is they call this one church, but it's really two churches. The two communities don't interact. And so you're seeing the first generation has no impact on the second generation. They don't even meet in the same room. And churches need to have the flow of intergenerational communication both ways. And then the second gen feels like second-class citizens. They don't have equal share in governance of the church or in say of anything. And so we need to fix that. You know, we need to have them speak into, well, what's the direction of the church, the direction of the ministry and everything. And so inevitably what happens is when these second gen get to college and then they enter a diverse, university setting, they find more resonance with all their English-speaking diversity than with their first-generation native-speaking, elders. And so, and then they leave, right? They call this the silent exodus, right? And we wonder why they're leaving. Because there isn't a partnership, there isn't a voice, there isn't a sense that they belong. The younger generation doesn't need believing before belonging. They need belonging before believing. And I think that will make so much of a difference.
That's good. I wonder if the church could somehow institute programs where it's both spiritually beneficial and then it's also functional. So what I mean by that is, I know, because I have a high schooler, she's so busy. I'm like, why is she busier than my husband who's a doctor, right? I'm like, your dad's on call and you're busier than your dad.
He's saving lives.
Yeah,
What are you doing?
What are you doing? She's so busy. And so I know if I asked her, like, hey, do you want to be like in an intergenerational like mentorship program? She'd be like, what, Mom? Like, no, I think she would. She's a really, she loves things like that. But let's say if she did that and she got community hours, or let's say they did something together in that discipleship. And so let's say a church would create, something between, let's say, like first generation, second generation, and then you actually went out and went to OCRM, or you went and served, let's say,
What's OCRM for those who don't know what that is?
Orange County Rescue Mission is one of our favorite places to serve, but somewhere where you can actually tangibly go serve together, and then that way I think it can cover a gamut of things. And I'm also thinking that you said something, Alan, about this generation having it the hardest. And as you're talking, I'm like, that's such a great point. Because I think what's hard about this generation is that they're taught it's not supposed to be hard. Your life is supposed to be easy. And life is about expectations, right? So if I look at a Yelp review and I'm like, oh, that restaurant's like so-so, but then the food is like better, I'm like, that was great. Like versus like I hear, oh, that's a 5-star restaurant and I go, and it's just okay. Then it's all about expectations. And so if you feel like your life is supposed to be easy, and life is never easy, God says so. In this life, you will have tribulation. And you have these like, photoshopped images of life, you're gonna not know how to function in life because of your expectation. Versus, no one would say, this generation has it harder than, let's say, like my father-in-law, who was born in North Korea. He lost most of his family. Like half of his siblings died in the war. And then he was like removed from his family for 5 years. And then they immigrated over here. No one would say that that's hard, but it's a different kind of hard. But at least for that generation, they called it hard. But I think it's that expectation. And so I think that for the older generation to bequeath wisdom and say, you know what, suffering is a virtue. And suffering is a tool that God uses. And I'm so guilty of this. Like, I want to remove all suffering from my kids' lives. Sure. But there are times when, when my girl, she was like trying to like flip over and like, it was like watching like a roly-poly or like a snail. And I just want to like flip her over. But I'm like, you're going to develop grit right now, And I think in a proverbial sense, in a lot of ways, we have to let them do that. So I think maybe programs within the church that allow serving together and learning together would be great.
Yeah. I think that so much of discipleship is life on life, and we can try to put discipleship into an add-on rather than just a natural part of our spiritual growth, but it requires intentionality to set aside the time. And that's where I think that so I'm picturing right now, many of my friends and I are moving into an empty nest stage. It'll come one day, right? It will come one day, kids will get their shoes on by themselves, get into the car by themselves, and drive away by themselves. But it's just, it's just a blink. But there are all of these incredibly wise and seasoned moms that are like equipped and ready to go. And could we connect them to meet up? Because I know that oftentimes I can say something into someone else's life that their mom can't say. And because I'm not directly related, I can actually speak some truth into life. So are there some ways to kind of make it natural to have access for some of these seasoned men and women to speak into this next generation? I think that would be so rich when it's not just like, yes, I understand primarily my kids are going to learn from me, but I loved raising my kids in campus ministry because they were with college students, and college students are always so cool. So they grew up, watching college students making big faith choices, and I think that influenced them for the good. So we become who we spend time with, and that's kind of a bottom line. We become who we spend time with, and so if we can introduce this younger generation to some great people, I just think that it goes really far. It can go really far.
I might just say one more thing. I heard Sky Jathani say that the most critical stage is, while the young people for sure, is he calls it the license to license window. So from the time you get your driver's license to the time you get your marriage license, okay? That window is when people are most likely to leave the church. And so we really need to nail that generation too. So yes, young people like high schoolers for sure, but a lot of people in their 20s, I think, are just dropping out of church. So how do we reach those young adults as well? Because they are untethered. They don't have a college community anymore, and then they don't have a marriage community or a family, and so they get lost during that period. So the license to license.
I will add a little nuance to that. On the one hand, I think that we need to capture people from every generation. On the other hand, a lot of studies show that young people, especially those who have grown up in the church, have already made their decision before the age of 18. So whether they leave or they stay, there is an element in which that's already been decided by the age of 18. Okay, yeah. And then the other piece is, I do think we lose a lot of people in the transitions. So what you're saying is absolutely right. No, this has been so good. I feel like we could have this go on forever, but we can't because we are limited in our humanity. And so this has been, thank you for joining me at the table. This has been a wonderful discussion, and for those of you who have tuned in, I hope that if you find this encouraging, that you would share it with others. But check out all of our other resources that we have on at the Asian American Christian Collaborative. Go on AACC or aachristcollab.com or asianamericanchristiancollaborative.com. Check out all the different collaborations we've done in the past and the other resources that are available. Further, if you're not following us on social media, do so at AA Christ Collab, and then sign up for our newsletter. And if you're interested, if this has been impactful for you, please feel free to drop us a line. But other than that, we'll look forward to seeing you next time.